Hi, this is Susan Swain, host of C-SPAN's Q&A podcast. While our program takes a short holiday break, we wanted to use this feed to share our newest podcast, Presidential Recordings. Season 1 looks at the presidency of Lyndon Johnson with 10 episodes showcasing secretly recorded conversations from the White House on topics ranging from the Warren Commission to the Vietnam War. If you enjoy presidential history, follow so you never miss an episode. Q&A will be back publishing in this feed on January 9.
Welcome to C-SPAN's Presidential Recordings. Our first season looks at the presidency of Lyndon Johnson. And we begin this episode aboard Air Force One, just hours after the death of President Kennedy. Now President Lyndon Johnson, along with new First Lady, Lady Bird Johnson, pay a condolence call to Rose Kennedy.
AF1 from Crown, Mrs. Kennedy on. Go ahead, please.
Hello, Mrs. Kennedy. Hello, Mrs. Kennedy. We're talking from the airplane. Can you hear us all right? Over.
Thank you. Hello.
Yes, Mrs. Kennedy. I have Mr. Johnson for you here.
Yes, thank you.
Ms. Kennedy?
Yes. Yes, Mr. President. Yes.
I wish to God there was something that I could do, and I wanted to tell you that we were grieving with you.
Yes, well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I know you love Jack and he loves you.
President Lyndon Johnson and First Lady, Lady Bird Johnson, speaking with John F. Kennedy's mother, Rose. According to the University of Virginia's Miller Center, President Johnson recorded more than 9,000 phone calls and meetings, totaling 850 hours of conversations. During his first year in office, he taped up to 30 phone calls a day. He used them to keep track of lobbying efforts and political engagements. But by 1965, he became more selective. This 10-part series will look at the milestone events during President Johnson's time in office, including the Warren Commission, the 1964 Civil Rights Bill, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, the 1964 presidential campaign, the March on Selma, the Great Society legislation, and the war in Vietnam. We'll be back in a moment.
Wyndham Hotels and Resorts makes travel possible for all. Whether it's the long haulers looking for a great cup of coffee, a roomier rest for the on-a-whim road trippers, or a place to make summer memories with the whole family. No matter who you are, where you're going, or why, with 24 trusted brands to choose from like La Quinta, Days Inn, and Super 8, your Wyndham is waiting. Get the lowest price at WyndhamHotels.com. Restrictions apply. Visit website for more details.
Now, before we dive into the series about the LBJ phone call tapes, we wanted to talk with Marc Selverstone. He's at the University of Virginia, where he chairs the Presidential Recordings Program in the Miller Center of Public Affairs. Professor Selverstone, C-SPAN has been playing these tapes, these phone call tapes, for years, but how did we find out and when that they existed?
Well, that all goes back to Richard Nixon in the summer of 1973 when the Senate Watergate Committee was exploring evidence that might have linked the White House to a variety of activities that came to be associated with Watergate, the grab-all convention for a host of activities the Nixon administration was involved in, illegal activities. And it came to light that President Nixon had a recording device in the Oval Office. It would turn out that he had recording devices elsewhere as well, including the residence and at Camp David. And it was a startling finding, one that would ultimately transform the Watergate investigation. But it also would transform the way that we came to understand the presidency and the specific presidencies of several who held that office, from Franklin Roosevelt all the way up through Nixon and beyond, because Ronald Reagan actually did make some tapes from the Situation Room, or at least funneled through the Situation Room with foreign heads of state. But Reagan did not really record those conversations in the surreptitious manner that Nixon did, nor his predecessors did, most significantly John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. And the day after it was disclosed that Nixon had a taping system, The questions went out to the head of the Kennedy Library and the head of the Johnson Library. Did those presidents also tape their conversations? And the answer was yes, they did.
So in 1993, they were finally at least partially released, 850 hours of recordings, 9,400 telephone conversations. Did the Johnson family have to give permission? Did they control the tapes?
Well, Lady Bird certainly gave her thumbs up to the process, which was extraordinarily important in legitimating the release of those materials. The library had come into possession of them following the end of the Johnson administration. Harry Middleton, the director of the library, knew about them once Lyndon Johnson had passed in January of 1973. And over time, he began to fear about their quality, given tape degradation and the challenges that would have resulted in trying to rescue whatever was on these materials. So he began the process after checking with lawyers at the library and the National Archives of processing these materials. They were unprocessed, not indexed, and he begins that process in 1990. Some tapes had been released earlier as part of a lawsuit, in fact, between the William Westmoreland's suit against CBS in 1982. But it was really the result of the Oliver Stone film JFK in 1991 that created such a firestorm around what might have resulted in Kennedy's assassination that the call went out to try to dig up whatever material the government might still be holding relating to the Kennedy assassination, particularly given Stone's thesis, much of it centering around Kennedy's and then Johnson's handling of Vietnam. And so some of those materials that the Assassination Records Review Board were interested in, a board that Congress impaneled, were these White House tapes. And so it was part of that broader effort to release them, to make them available, that Middleton then approached Lady Bird and even though President Johnson himself had indicated that these materials were not to see the light of day for 50 years, Lady Bird gave her assent that, yes, they can be released, believing, as Middleton did as well, that they would redound to Johnson's benefit in the court of public opinion. And I think that they were both proved right in that regard. So the tapes begin to come out in bulk really in the latter part of the 1990s, and resulting in, as you say, those 850 hours of tapes as a whole.
So, Marc Selverstone, in 2008, the entire library was released, correct?
Well, not the entire library. There are still materials that have been withheld, and that's usually on account of conversations that Johnson had that touch on the personal dimensions of various figures on the tapes or relationships he might have had with these figures. If the material on the tapes relates to Johnson's conduct in office and the way he discharged the powers of the office, then that's all fair game. But once the content of the conversations begin to veer off into more specifically personal matters, then that material is usually redacted and withheld. Now, researchers can essentially petition the government for a review of that material to get them released. But it is the case in the Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon recordings, which constitute 99% of all of the secret presidential recordings, that you have a fair amount of material that is withheld.
Professor Selverstone, do we know anything about President Johnson's motivation in creating these tapes?
Well, this wasn't the first time that LBJ had recorded his conversations. There's some indication that he might have recorded while in the Senate, but better evidence that he recorded when he was vice president. And we're confident that the Lyndon Johnson Library is working through those materials now to try to release them and help us better understand Johnson as a public servant and hopefully give us a better clue as to what kind of a president he was. But Johnson recognized that the tapes that he would use as president certainly would help him in the conduct of his official duties. It would be easier for him to recall, even though his powers of recall were simply extraordinary. It would be easier for him to have a better sense of what transpired in conversations with legislators who came into his office. And we do know that some of these conversations in the office were recorded on speakerphone. But usually they were telephone conversations. So, yes, when Johnson spoke to a legislator on the phone, he would have those often have those tapes recorded. And his secretaries transcribed many of them in real time, providing Johnson with these readouts that he could then refer to subsequently to hold somebody's feet to the fire. And it wasn't just legislators. Johnson taped conversations with cabinet officials, with private individuals, businessmen, with confidants or confidants such as Clark Clifford or Abe Fortas. They really provide a wonderful window into the presidency and specifically Johnson's presidency itself.
Well, what we do know about President Johnson is that he could be very persuasive. We want to play a call from February 1st, 1964. It was with Kennedy brother-in-law Sargent Shriver, and we hear President Johnson informing Mr. Shriver that he will be named as the head of the War on Poverty.
Mark? Good morning, Mr. President. How are you?
I'm going to announce your appointment at press conference.
What press conference?
This afternoon.
Oh, God, I think it would be advisable, if you don't mind, if I could have this weekend, I wanted to sit down with a couple of people and see what we could get in the way of some sort of a plan, because what happens, at least my thought is that what happens is that you announce somebody or hear somebody else, and they don't know what the hell they're doing or what the program's going to be specifically, and who's going to carry it. Then you're in a hell of a hole because they all start calling you up and saying, well, now, what are you going to do?
Well,
carry this out and all that. And you
just don't talk to them. Just go away and go to Camp David. Figure it out. We need something to say to the press. We've got to say to them, and I've got to tell them what I talked to you about yesterday. And you can just take off, work out your Peace Corps any way you want to. You can be head of the committee and have some acting operator. If you want Bill to help you, I'll let him do that. I'll do anything, but I want to announce this and get it behind me, so I quit getting all these other pressures. And I think you've got to do it. You just can't let me down. So the quicker we get it behind us, the better. And you can talk to them as special assistant to the president a hell of a lot easier, and you can talk to them just as peace administrator. And if they want to talk to you, you can tell them. Speak for me.
And that was from February 1st, 1964, President Johnson talking with Sargent Shriver. We're talking with Marc Selverstone of the University of Virginia. Professor Selverstone, what does that call tell us about President Johnson, and how much persuasion have you witnessed in these tapes?
Well, I think this tape, along with several others, indicates that it was really difficult for Johnson to take no for an answer. This tape goes on, and LBJ is simply relentless in not letting Shriver off the hook. He is going to be the head of this war on poverty. And for Johnson, he needed somebody in that position pretty quickly, because it was about a month earlier, in early January, that he had talked about launching this war on poverty, and so didn't want to let more time go by and convey the impression that the administration didn't have its act together. So he needs somebody in that position. Shriver is a perfect person for that, especially given his ties, as you mentioned, to the Kennedys. But Johnson uses all his powers of persuasion that he had honed in a lifetime of persuading, from bullying to shaming to flattery to really buttering up Shriver. He's simply not going to let Shriver go, going so far as to say that you're simply going to appear at this press conference where we're going to announce your name. It calls to mind, as I mentioned, several other conversations of the sort. One of them that comes to mind is Johnson's conversation with Richard Russell in the days after Senator Richard Russell from Georgia, in the days after the Kennedy assassination, in which Johnson places Russell on the Warren Commission, much to Russell's reluctance, especially because that meant Russell would have had to work with Chief Justice Earl Warren, who would be running that commission. And given Warren's stance on civil rights and his role in the Brown v. Board education decision from the previous decade, that was really anathema to him. But it's of a pattern that you see with Johnson in which he, again, uses all of these tools to try to get his way.
Now, according to your former associate, David Coleman, who was an associate professor at the Miller Center, Robert Kennedy learned of the taping system pretty early on in LBJ's presidency. Does that mean that others, including perhaps Sergeant Shriver, who we just heard, did they know about this taping system as well?
I'm not so sure that Shriver knew about it, but certainly Johnson's secretaries knew because they were tasked with transcribing many of those conversations. In fact, they were the ones who made sure that the conversations were taped, as Johnson would signal to them through an open door between his office and theirs that they were to take that conversation or to tape that conversation. The Secret Service officials who manned the system also knew that it was taped. It's possible that Walter Jenkins might have suspected that Johnson was taping, given what we presume to be Jenkins's role during Johnson's vice presidency, perhaps, in facilitating the taping of calls then. It's also conceivable later on that his chief of staff in the second administration, or the presidency that Johnson wins on his own from 65 through 69, Marvin Watson, that he might have suspected as well, because Watson himself taped calls that were coming in. So it was not unheard of at the time, but Bobby Kennedy certainly knew by the tail end of his brother's administration that calls were being taped. And yes, indeed, we believe that he was doubly cautious when speaking with LBJ, that whatever he said might get repeated back verbatim someday.
Is there any thought to how he learned? Was it through Evelyn Lincoln, President Kennedy's secretary, or Arthur Schlesinger, maybe?
Well, we do know that some of the missile crisis tapes were used in early drafts of Bobby Kennedy's, what would become his essentially drafts of a book that would turn into 13 Days for the campaign of 1968. But we don't know precisely when he found out about it in 1963, even though we do know that his secretary in late 63 knew about it. So there are still some mysteries surrounding the tapes, and the knowledge that Kennedy associates as well as Johnson associates had of those materials, that's still, I think, out there remaining to be discovered.
UVA professor Marc Selverstone, I should have asked you this early on, I guess, but were these tapes treated as official government records?
Well, these records were seen or understood by the presidents themselves to be the private property of those individuals, and they did not become the public property of the United States until Congress passed the Presidential Records Act of 1978, which ended kind of a tortuous history from the point in 1973 when we learned about the tapes to 1974 when Nixon resigned and Congress essentially sequestered all the tapes to make sure that they would not be destroyed, to finally then again in 78, which transformed those materials from private property to public property. So when the presidents were making these tape recordings, no one had a sense that they would be disclosed, that the presidents were either going to be using them for their own purposes in real time, such as Johnson did, or for posterity as they wrote their memoirs, as Kennedy would likely have done, or just to maintain a record of what was said, not necessarily for the powers of persuasion that they might have added to Johnson's kit bag, but to have a record of what transpired. And this is some of what had gone on with Richard Nixon. But nobody really, none of these individuals thought that they were likely to be outed at a later date.
And we're talking with Marc Selverstone, who is chair of the Presidential Recordings Program at the Miller Center at the University of Virginia. And according to the Miller Center, President Johnson taped up to 29 phone calls a day. He taped everybody, including his wife, Lady Bird. Here from March 7th, 1964, a conversation between the president and Mrs. Johnson. She's talking about how he looked when he was giving a speech.
Mrs. Johnson is calling, asking if she could speak to the president for a moment concerning his press conference. You want to listen for about 1 minute to my critique, or would you rather wait till tonight?
Yes, ma'am. I'm willing now.
I thought that you looked strong, firm, and like a reliable guy. Your looks were splendid. The close-ups were much better than the distance ones.
Well, you can't get them to good.
Well, I will say this. There were more close-ups than there were distance ones. During the statement, you were a little breathless, and there was too much looking down, and I think it was a little too fast. Not enough change of pace. A drop in voice at the end of sentence. There was a considerable pickup in drama and interest when the questioning began. Your voice was noticeably better, and your facial expression was noticeably better. The mechanics of the room were not too good, because although I heard you well throughout every bit of it, I did not hear your questioners clearly.
Well, the questioners won't talk.
Some of them you could hear, but in generally you could not hear them very well. Every now and then you need a good, crisp answer for change of pace, and therefore I was very glad when you answered one man. The answer is no to both of your questions.
Marc Selverstone, that was President Johnson and his wife, Lady Bird Johnson. We heard a beep in there. Was that a redaction?
Yes, that's exactly what it would be. Likely something that President Johnson had said about, if I recall, one of those journalists that he was referring to.
When it comes to these tapes, were there several with Lady Bird, and is she always quite forward with her advice?
Yeah, this I think is a revealing tape with Lady Bird. Johnson tapes a variety of conversations with her. Oftentimes, somebody else is on the line, whether it's Dick Russell or somebody else that may be coming to dinner that night, or a politician that the two of them know, and Johnson puts Lady Bird on to say hello. And she is wonderful. She is one of his best, perhaps in some ways, most helpful advisors. And her political savvy was extraordinary. In this conversation, you see her doing what few people really could do to President Johnson or with President Johnson, and that is really speak truth to power. She is commenting on his appearance, on his delivery, on the content, what it is he's saying, and when he's saying it. She's even talking about maybe some ways to reshape the room so the acoustics are better. It's really a complete rundown that she provides, at the end of which she pronounces his performance with the grade of a B+. So she is on it, and he greatly values her opinion, which is why he's asking or accepting it here. And he had asked for it at other times. And I would stress that he really did seek it out, because frequently in the mornings when Johnson would begin his day, just getting up from bed, the first thing he would do is turn to some of the night reading that lay on his table, stacks of well over 100 pages, and would routinely pass along memos to Lady Bird next to him for her response. So she was up on what it was Johnson himself was facing, and is, as I mentioned previously, one of his most important advisors, certainly in the run-up to the 1964 Democratic Convention, when she has to really talk him into running. He had been kind of hemming and hawing over whether he should go ahead and do it, which we would see throughout Johnson's career, in fact. But she is adamant that he needs to make sure that he goes to Atlantic City and accepts the nomination of his party as president. And then into 1968, when Johnson for months and months is toying with the idea of not running, Lady Bird is also instrumental in that decision as well.
Where can people find and listen to the tapes in their entirety, Professor Selverstone?
There are several places to do so. Certainly the Lyndon Johnson Library, which is the repository of all of the tapes, all of the Johnson tapes. I think audiences would do well to go to the library site. The Miller Center itself, through our website, millercenter.org, also makes the tapes available for free download, so visitors to our site can do that. The work that we do in transcribing and publishing scholarly editions of these transcripts with scene setters, full annotations, and footnotes, that's available through the University of Virginia Press at the Presidential Recordings Digital Edition, our publication that we use to publish really all of our work on the presidential recordings. But then lastly, I would encourage your audience to visit lbjtapes.org, which is a collaboration that we entered into with the Johnson Library last year to make available free of charge to the public upwards of 100 conversations that span the entirety of Johnson's presidency and touch on some of the most crucial issues that came before him. That's lbjtapes.org.
And we've been talking with Marc Selverstone, chair of the Presidential Recordings Program at the University of Virginia's Miller Center. Professor Selverstone, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleased to be with you.
Hear history as it happened with President Lyndon Johnson's private phone calls, coming up on this first season of C-SPAN's Presidential Recordings. Find it wherever you listen to podcasts and subscribe so you never miss an episode.